Hey, everybody. So I was away all last week on vacation, and a lot seems to have happened while I was gone. So I just want to step back and look at the big picture of what just happened while I was away. And then this coming week, I hope to go deeper into some of the things that I'm only going to mention today. But while I was away, the big picture kind of came into focus for me. I think that the past several weeks, and last week in particular, the week that began with the No Kings protests on Saturday, I think that week is going to be written down in history as a key turning point in Donald Trump's permanent decline into madness. And that's if we're still allowed to write history in the years to come. I'm not saying that he won't be president for the next 3+ years, or that the American people will be for sure woken up and that they'll throw his party out of office. None of that's determined. That's going to depend on whether we're able to band together to wake up a nation that I think is sleepwalking off a cliff right now. But Donald Trump personally, I think, took a dramatic turn deeper into his own madness this past week. And I don't think he's ever getting better. First, because he clearly doesn't want to get better. And second, because he's surrounded by sycophants who also don't want him to get better. So let's talk about Trump's madness and why this week in particular, I think, was such a turning point in his decline. And I don't mean dementia or anything like that. I'm going to leave that sort of thing to the medical doctors. I'm talking about his disordered personality, which I think he's had his whole life. But it's taken a very dark turn lately. And I'm not qualified to diagnose him here. I mean, I was trained as a pastor, not a psychologist. But I'll put the traits for antisocial personality disorder on the screen while I'm talking here for a minute, because they do paint a picture of some of the tendencies that Trump has shown his whole life. So whether or not a professional would say that he's got that disorder, which a lot of people simply call sociopathy, I think we can agree that someone with these traits just ought not to be president of the United States. And even though we've known these things about him for a long time, what's different about this week is that he seems to have fully stopped pretending to be anything other than what he's always been. This week, he did several public acts that show that he's gone all in, that he's owning his disordered personality. And unfortunately, he's being propped up by those around him as he revels in some of his worst instincts. Clearly, this guy no longer feels any of the restraints that you'd want a person like him to feel. He's no longer restrained by the law or by his advisors, and he's not restrained by the systems that were designed to hold, I guess, a normal president in check. It turns out that those systems can't even touch a sociopath who's backed by an out-of-control religious mob. So, impeachment and removal are all we have left as of right now. But that out-of-control religious mob is intimidating the Republican Congress from doing their duty. So this last thing, though, about Trump's madness, I think is especially important. Because of his vast powers as president to shape his own narrative, I don't think he any longer feels restrained by reality itself. And of course, Trump has lived in a smaller version of a false reality his whole life, one in which he's the primary actor in his own imagined universe. And he's spent his entire life telling a fire hose of lies to prop up that false reality. And because of the wealth that he inherited, combined with, I think, a complete lack of regret or any discernible empathy for the people that he hurts along the way, I think he's been able to create a reality distortion field around himself for his entire life. And there have always been people willing to debase themselves in order to get a piece of his action. And so as he's grown his power, he's attracted more of those people until now he's managed to extend that reality distortion field out to an entire nation, to the point that millions of people voted for him for a third time in 2024. So here we are finally at this past week. During this past week specifically, Trump made several moves that I believe were meant to tell every one of us, I am the sole authority in this nation. You have no power to stop me, and I no longer have to even pretend to be acting in your interests anymore. And I think it started with the No Kings protests on Saturday. Trump and his accomplices first tried to brand the protesters as a bunch of violent radicals, but it turned out they were just Americans. And I saw a lot of grandpas and grandmas at the protest that I attended in Madison. And I got choked up when I saw a very old woman who was bent over a walker, and her sign just read, "My body can't stand straight, but my spirit is standing tall against Donald Trump." So when Trump realized that he just couldn't make those protesters out to be the scary villains that he hoped they'd be, he did what I'm sure seemed like a rational choice to someone like him. He released an AI video of himself flying a fighter jet and dropping feces on the protesters. And of course, his followers saw that as, owning the libs. But for the rest of us, the ones who still choose to live in the reality-based world, that stupid little AI video crossed a line that no president has crossed before, at least not in public. I mean, I can imagine Richard Nixon drunkenly ranting at the paintings in the White House and swearing at the American people who rejected him. But he didn't do that in public. Trump is unhinged in a way that no previous president has been. So he started his week with that giant AI-generated F you to anyone in America who isn't on board with his insanity. But then he followed that up with some things that were not AI. They were absolutely real, with real world consequences. For instance, this week, he made two inexcusable decisions to grant clemency to people who supported him. He commuted George Santos's 7-year sentence for massive acts of fraud. And then he pardoned the founder of Binance. And it would take a separate video to adequately get into all the conflicts of interest in those acts of clemency. But the point in doing those acts, I think, was clear. He's saying what every authoritarian wants to say, that law and order means what I tell you it means. Law and order means that my enemies get punished, and my friends are free to do as they please so long as they remain my friends. And that's what happens when you make a criminal the president of the United States. And of course, every president makes a few unpopular pardons, but most of them wait until the end of their term to do that. The timing of Trump's pardons is, I think, just as important as the shamelessness. Trump began his second term by pardoning the January 6th insurrectionists. And that sent a strong message to the nation right at the beginning. He was basically saying, I will severely punish protesters who oppose me, and I'll even threaten to use the Insurrection Act against them. But actual political violence that was done in my name, that's acceptable. Because by definition, if it was done in my name, then it was done for a righteous cause. But even those pardons of the January 6th rioters were different from the clemency that he handed down this week, because he at least pretended to act on principle with the January 6th rioters. He was claiming that they'd been harshly treated for political reasons. But with Santos and this Binance dude, he doesn't even pretend. He wants the nation to know right now, while it can still benefit him, that he's totally fine with corruption so long as the corruption serves his interests. And no president has ever been so boldly and so publicly corrupt as to make those sorts of clemency moves that Trump made just this week. And that leads me to the next thing. Some articles came out this week that are starting to add up Trump's corruption in monetary figures. And it's already in the billions. So that'll have to be its own video, hopefully next week, documenting the billions of dollars that Trump's family has already earned this year off of the presidency. But again, he's enriching himself with a brazenness that no president, at least in my lifetime, has ever attempted. And he's getting away with it. And that's only feeding his madness. It's only feeding his sense of invulnerability. But in case we might be tempted to think, well, if he were truly a mad authoritarian, wouldn't he be doing violence to people? And, of course he would. And of course he is. And even that, I think, has gotten worse the past couple weeks. He's publicly weaponized the Justice Department against 3 specific enemies so far. And I think that serves as a warning to anyone in his own administration who might dare to blow any whistles or criticize him from within. And of course, he's continued to massively ramp up his ICE activities, and he's increased his threats to put troops on the streets of American cities. So he's just getting started, I think, on the actions that he's taking against people in this country that he decides are his enemies. But he's also begun to have his military actively kill people who they suspect of running drugs, blowing their boats out of the water. And he's sharing the films out to his fans because I'm assuming, I can only assume, that the titillation that, they got from, just one more boring video of ICE agents throwing women onto the pavement, that titillation was wearing off. So Fox News needed more content. So I think we can expect the snuff films to keep coming. And if you think I'm exaggerating the crudeness and the stupidity of this whole warfighter media campaign, just this week, when Trump was asked if he ought to get Congress to officially declare war on the people he's, blowing out of the water as an act of extrajudicial killing. Extrajudicial killing, by the way, that sort of thing used to happen a lot back when America was great. They had a term for extrajudicial killing. Right, they called it lynching, and they sold postcards of the hangings. So now that America is apparently great again, maybe Fox News is just the new postcard. But anyway, when Trump was asked if he ought to get a declaration of war or something for decorum's sake, if nothing else, he responded, I'm not going to necessarily ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country. They're going to be dead. And regarding that reality distortion field around him, he went on to justify his methods by claiming that for every boat that's blown out of the water, 25,000 American lives are saved. And I've got some issues with that. For instance, he's already declared that any of us who speak out against him are enemies of the people. So if he starts making claims about the number of American lives that are saved by, say, every podcaster he imprisons, all the evidence suggests that his followers are going to accept that rationale. And all you need to know to understand Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity is this. Millions of Fox News viewers heard him tell that obvious lie, that every boat blown out of the water saves 25,000 American lives. And they instantly knew that was asinine. But in the very next instant, with the very next firing of a synapse, they willingly believed his lie anyway. That's Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity in a nutshell. When I call his followers stupid, I'm not insulting their intelligence. I'm insulting their character, because no one is actually dumb enough to believe a lie like that. But millions of white evangelical Trump supporters, for example, are exactly corrupt enough to pretend that they believe that lie. So all of that is kind of disturbing, and it's all an escalation of Trump's worst tendencies. But the thing that will put this week in the history books, I think, is that he tore down the east wing of the White House to put up a gilded ballroom. And it's not that this is the most authoritarian thing he did this week. It's just that the visual is perfect. Historians aren't going to be able to resist calling this Trump's let them eat cake moment. And the books are going to show that this was the week he chose his destiny. If I were writing a novel and I wanted to hit people over the head with symbolism, if I wanted to show the deterioration into madness of a president who fancied himself a king, I couldn't do better than having him go against all the established policies of how you make changes like this and just tear down part of the White House, because the White House has always intentionally symbolized executive power rather than kingly power. It symbolizes the power of a citizen executive who temporarily heads one of three co-equal branches of government. It's a really nice house, but it's a house. It's not a palace. And you couldn't come up with a better visual metaphor for Trump's ambitions than to demolish part of that house to put up a gilded monstrosity of a ballroom. Something really only, I think, the very tackiest of kings would add to his palace, if that king felt compelled to compensate for something. And it's above my pay grade to speculate on what this particular president might be compensating for. I can only look at what he's doing and say, this week, Trump crossed some lines that I believe removed any chance that he may have had for a peaceful sort of off-ramp. He's attacked our democracy so bombastically, so publicly, that I think our democracy has no choice but to try to put things to right. After he lost the 2020 election, he and his supporters claim that Biden weaponized the justice system against him, but that's just not true. Merrick Garland showed restraint, and I would say too much restraint. And he did that because Trump was a former president. According to the indictments, for example, Trump defied the government's requests for months when they asked him to return classified documents, and he lied to them repeatedly. He forced their hand. And the January 6th case would never have been brought, I don't think, if Congress had not forced their hand by bringing so many details out into the public light. And after the choices he made this week, I think Trump knows that he just won't get that sort of kid gloves treatment again. So he chose his path this week, and I think permanently. And that path has only three possible outcomes. The first is very unlikely, but Trump might be mad enough to try to make it happen. That's the outcome where he remains president after 2028 for the rest of his life. And we can talk about that sometime, but I do think that's unlikely. But the second outcome is very possible. That's where one of his acolytes takes his place and allows Trump to retire in peace and enjoy his billions. And for good measure, that one leaves the door open for Barron Trump to take his rightful place on the throne someday. But the third possibility is also very likely, and that's the one where his chosen successor loses the next election. And if that happens, Donald Trump is going to spend the rest of his life fighting off criminal charges and civil lawsuits as the democracy that he tried to destroy begins setting things to right. And I think we all know that he's going to do anything in his power not to let that be the outcome he faces. And none of us know how that's going to turn out, but I know that I'm committed to work for that third outcome. Not because I want to see Donald Trump punished, but because I love this country. And I just don't think that he's left a fourth option available to himself anymore, one where he spends his retirement building houses for Habitat for Humanity. Justice demands that his story doesn't end that way. Justice demands now that he be treated fairly, but that he's required to make amends for the damage he's done. And it doesn't make me happy to say that, but that's the path he's chosen, and that's the choice that's before our country over the next few years. After this week, I just don't see how we can go back. So thanks for listening.